for the industry and where we're going. A little bit of a primer on this particular piece of legislation, which is a hot topic right now. I'm sure a number of you are seeing it if you're in provincially incorporated organizations. Talk a little bit about members' rights provisions and member class changes. So that's sort of the legislative piece that we're sort of drilling down around. Look at who might be impacted by some of those changes and what that could mean for volunteer engagement and retention. Some alternate ways to maybe look at recognizing volunteers that might sort of take the edge off of some of these changes. And then talk a little bit about some of the actual underlying governance concerns. So one of the things that I probably should have mentioned in my bio is that I'm a chartered director. I received my designation from McMaster University over the fall. And so I have some sort of two sides of the thoughts on this topic. And then a quick sort of summary of takeaways and hopefully quite a bit of Q&A because I don't think anybody really wants to listen to me talk for an hour. So what was going on before ONCA CNCA, right? So ONCA or ONCA is the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, and CNCA is the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. And both of these acts are, I mean, roughly 15 years old in terms of when they were sort of brought into the legislature and sort of started to be discussed, debated, and enacted. And sort of prior to both of these pieces of legislation being brought in and being brought into force, not-for-profits were actually incorporated under the same act as the regular for-profit corporations. So in theory, you could have seen your local food bank being subject to the same legislation as like Rogers Communications. And so a lot of this was really a recognition of the importance and unique nature of not-for-profits. And so some of our responses to this really have to be thoughtfully aligned, I would say. And in those sort of previous versions or apps, stakeholder or sort of member rights were seen as the same as shareholder rights, or sometimes we call them stakeholders, although we're trying not to use that word anymore. And so we can see where in a not-for-profit organization where we are targeting making impact, equating those members to shareholders and profit would have been really challenging. So what is the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act? I'm sure that this is a repeat for most of you, and I apologize, but I want to make sure we're all kind of coming from the same place. As a former college professor, I have that inclination and maybe an inclination to over-explain. But the ONCA was first introduced into the legislature in 2010, but was not proclaimed until 2021. And those of you who are members of organizations that are provincially incorporated likely know that the deadline to comply with ONCA is October 18th of this year. So one of the big pieces that's been happening in the space in service of compliance is looking at bylaws. And one of the parts of bylaws, as we all know, is the definition of members and members' rights and who gets to vote and how they're notified and all of those sorts of key pieces of information. And so this is just really more a note for those of you in case this is new news, which is that there is a template bylaw that's available through the government. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that likely most organizations will need some sort of legal support along the way. And part of the reason that ONCA was so delayed in coming into force was a concern about particularly smaller organizations' capacity to comply with the legislation and the legal burden. And I know that the government of Ontario did flow some monies through sort of legal aid organizations. So please keep that in mind, particularly if you are an organization that is really heavily volunteer run and has a really tight budget. So what was the chief concern with the ONCA? There were originally some members' rights provisions that were of very high concern. And I will say candidly, I don't know what I was doing in December of 2020. Well, I have some idea. We were in the middle of a global crisis, but I personally didn't notice until very farther down the line, and I know some organizations didn't notice before they made changes, that some of those non-voting member rights actually did get scaled back. So there was a lot of concern early on that ONCA included provisions for voting rights for members that wouldn't otherwise have voting, things like honorary members, retirees, that sort of piece. However, the entire legislation really was created with an orientation towards increasing member rights relative to what had been seen in sort of for-profit legislation, and even in comparison to the CNCA. And so there's a lot of reasons why organizations might want to think about these sort of member classes. And so one of the reasons that organizations may choose to limit members' rights is really around predictability, right? So if you have a sense of who's voting, what sorts of classes are voting, and what their priorities are, it's easier to predict. And one of the stories that sort of emerged in the news around the time the ONCA was introduced, that I know was of concern to a lot of organizations, related to the Convenience Store Owners Association in Ontario, which voted out its entire board. And those sorts of changes, while important in terms of members being able to raise their voice, so it can be incredibly disruptive to an organization, as I'm sure we can all appreciate. The other reason that sometimes organizations choose to amend their member classes or to sort of reduce member classes or to never extend those rights in the first place may be related to the mission. So an example of this might be in an organization where there are a lot of other stakeholders, be they donors or other individuals who have interests in the future of the organization that are out of alignment with the mission and in particular charitable purposes of an organization may choose to curtail those individuals' sort of voting rights. And I know also a number of charities, including one that I sort of have a sightline into, is scoping their membership class to really be only those individuals who were part of the community being served by the organization, and or elected members of their board in that specific instance. So what this can look like in practice, and what as member managers and member resource professionals you sort of are looking for, is sort of the reduction of member classes. So that might be taking reference to honorary members, retired members, student members, either out of the bylaws or moving them into a non-voting class, which is now contemplated by ONCA as well. It may be a more stringent criteria for remaining member classes. So it may be moving them into non-voting categories, or it might be curtailing the criteria that makes you eligible to be part of that organization. So, for example, in a professional association, it might be saying, your membership essentially expires, 24 months after you stop being active in an industry, or something along those lines. And it might be a reclassification of what would previously have been sort of affiliate members as sort of friends of, or not recognizing them inside your documents in that way. And the note here, and really, I think the sort of hypothesis of my presentation is that these individuals who could be affected, we know this, people like honorary members, people like our sponsors, can really be often very prolific volunteers. And so the decisions that get made from a governance perspective can have these incredible impacts on volunteerism. And obviously, we all know that we are in the middle of a volunteer crisis in this country, right? Volunteer Canada has absolutely rung the alarm bells on this, and no doubt PAVRO members are feeling this within their organizations as well, right? So I think this is fairly self-evident, but I wanted to sort of articulate it, that when individuals who have a sense of belonging in our organization have that sense of belonging challenged in terms of how they feel they are recognized, and the impact or influence they are able to have on our organization changes, we could see things like withdrawing or reducing their volunteer engagement, potentially in official protest, but it may also be sort of like a slow burn. Reducing or withholding donations, sponsorships, or in-kind support, right? So if they feel like they have less power to dictate how those monies are used or spent or prioritized. And it, in the case of the work that PAVRO members do, and many of the rest of us in the not-for-profit sector, this idea of diminished recruitment or retention to fill some of those incredible volunteer roles and responsibilities that we know drives our sector across the sector. So this is where I'd love to get a little bit of engagement, because I'm super aware of the fact that everybody's been listening to my voice. And having had the opportunity to teach a couple of college courses, I know you're all probably very bored of me by now. So I have some thoughts on alternate ways to engage and recognize volunteers. But I would really love people to use the chat to tell me what we're missing, or let's get a little bit of a conversation going about where we can use the expertise of the folks in this room to look at ways to mitigate a little bit of these sort of negative impacts by creating other places for individuals to get that sense of belonging. I'm also happy to have people come off mute and sort of shout their answers out if typing isn't something you're comfortable with.
So, Danielle, you know that I've been interested in this tug of war in these kinds of organizations between the folks who consider at the moment of their decision to join, what's in it for me, or alternatively, what's in it for the good of the order, using the phrases that Alexis de Tocqueville came up with in 1830. It was very kind of you to submit to that interview for me, but it's become increasingly clear to me that almost everybody that studies these organizations breaks it down in those two ways. It's either self-motivation, what they can attain from the organization, or they're interested in what they can do for what the organization serves, its purpose, its mission. So I'm fascinated by this this work, these ideas, this concept that there's always this tug of war. How do the Yonka or ONCA deliberations consider these two dynamics? Are they actually thinking about changes to membership structure with those two realities in mind, or do they just ignore those realities?
Well, I will say, I think that the fact that they did pull back some of those non-voting member class voting rights, is an indication that they sort of woke up and they were like, oh, we are making some very significant sort of governance changes, in the name of members' rights. But I think what's interesting is individual organizations seem to be going kind of one way or the other. And I think what's really sort of fascinating, and the piece that I'm really sort of fascinated with, is that you could argue that many of these changes are ostensibly, although not consciously, about managing for the what's in it for me crowd. But I think that the challenge becomes when the what's in it for me crowd get clustered into these membership categories or these supporter categories, with the folks that are actually there for the what can I do to be of service or to serve this organization. And that, I think, is really sort of the premise of what I'm wanting to flag for volunteer managers, but then also talk about understanding why some of those governance decisions are being made. And I will say, the next slide is a little bit about understanding how we have that internal conversation. But I agree with you, Jean. It's really tough, and I know, even just as somebody who sits on both sides of the table, it's an incredibly hard balance to strike. And you and I were sort of chatting before the webinar started about an individual we've both had on each of our boards, who I think often falls into the what's in it for me category, but is very charismatic about making it look like they're in the good of the organization category. And those individuals are really challenging to manage for without constantly imposing these unintended negative consequences. There's a comment here from Aisha. I like the idea of creating a new meaningful opportunities for people to have influence, like an advisor group. If the changes are seen as the ending of a role, I think bridging the gap so they can see new roles for themselves would be important, as well as maybe recognition of service in the previous role. Yes, so I think that those are all sort of really key components of recognizing that we're making these changes. Heather.
Thank you. This is an interesting thing to think about, because I think in reality, many volunteers possibly don't understand. I'm thinking on the ground volunteers, not necessarily your leadership or folks that have already raised their hand to declare I'm interested in a governance role within an organization. But I think most of your frontline volunteers in most organizations, and I've worked for a lot of them over my 25-year career, don't see this role of governance as part of why they got involved. So, so I think in some cases, having the reduction of membership categories can actually be a benefit to organizations, because, for example, PAVRO, we have almost 200 members. I have yet to be at any event where all 200 members are in attendance. So, you know, in some cases, there has been real panic around my board table when we were thinking we have an issue to bring forward, and our bylaws currently say I need 2/3 of the membership. Well, that's really, really challenging for a myriad of reasons. Our membership is involved in like every subsector within the not-profit world. So there's a very good reality that the time and day that my board says this is when we're going to meet isn't going to work for everybody. We also, the challenges around being able to do proxies and things like that, all those pieces. So in some ways, the reduction of membership categories can actually, I think, help improve the overall governance of an organization by providing fewer people who have the decision-making capacities. There certainly needs to be transparency. There certainly needs to be excellent communications, so the non-voting members know what's going on and can have their say. So I think when I look at this, I'm thinking the recognition pieces, the how to create different categories, the how do you ensure that people still feel valued is a huge piece of which volunteer engagement professionals and the staff who work with volunteers have a huge part in to make sure that they feel connected to the mission of the organization. But my experience has been that there's a decent number of volunteers in most organizations who probably be pretty happy to leave the governance to a smaller group of people. Now, that said, if something goes completely south, we're going to hear from them really, really quickly. So I think that also speaks to having good, solid governance practices in place that do their very best to ensure that all the due diligences have been taken taken into account, and good records are kept. So that if anyone's, if a board or a governance structure is ever challenged, you can demonstrate the due diligence that you've done in the hopes that that is sufficient. That's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I didn't think you actually wanted me to spend an hour nerding out on how to write an agenda and how to keep your minutes and all of that kind of stuff, right? But this is, at the very core part of the premise of this presentation, which is Heather did a really good job of articulating why these governance decisions might be made at a board table. And you also did a really good job of sort of highlighting one of the key sort of concerns, which is how are these communicated and how are you understanding the balance? And so, I mean, I think for me, I'm highlighting here's one of the potential unintended consequences of making these really smart governance decisions. But I agree with you. There's a lot of other pieces that have to be part of that puzzle. Particularly if you really, if this is a group of people who has traditionally been given a higher level of information to inform their engagement, whether or not they were actually using it, and are now not going to automatically see the annual report or whatever those sort of key pieces of information are. So yes, there's a lot of levers, I think, that we sort of end up trying to pull. And I think, your point really segues well into one of the points Jessica has dropped in the chat about the challenges around advisory councils, because they're asked for input, but they believe there is influence. And that becomes part of that sort of communications piece as well, especially when somebody's level of influence or level of sort of power to influence the system is changing. And I agree with you, by the way, Jessica. So I happen to chair an advisory council for the city of Markham. And I always say we give advice, but not binding advice. And I think sometimes that particular piece, there's so much need to talk about that and to be so incredibly clear. And I like to say, I like to put people in flexible boxes. And I think that's part of the flexible box that you want to sort of establish when you're moving somebody from you have a vote that impacts either who's on the board or some of these big changes like who our auditor is this year, versus you have a say that will inform the board or some of those voting groups. Dean, and then I know there's a couple things in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to point out that there's two or three other folks who have contributed some ideas that I know you would like to speak to. But in terms of this tug of war that I mentioned between on the one end, folks who ask the question, what's in it for me? And on the other end, what's in it for the good of the order? We acknowledge there's a spectrum of motivations there, and that's what makes our leadership job so challenging. And in fact, I think it really points out the value of transformational leadership as opposed to transactional, but that's another issue. I wanted to share this book if anybody's interested in the dynamics of what it is that we're sharing right now. It came out about 11 years ago from the American Society of Associations of Executives, and I recommend it to everybody. Although I will say the argument, some of the arguments that they make in it, I'm beginning to be more suspicious of. But it's called The Decision to Join by James Dalton and Monica Dignam. It really, really strikes a good balance between the tug of war that we're talking about, between these two camps, and even argues in statistical references that folks who are in it just for themselves turn out to have this element of wanting to contribute to the good of the order or the purpose of the organization as well. And if you really think about value propositions, imagine how hard that is for us to do, because you need a value proposition for the folks that are in it for themselves and another value proposition that's more aligned to the purpose of the organization. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the book suggestion. I would also say one of the books that I've really enjoyed, and I know when I was on the board of CSAE, every CSAE director gets a copy, is The Imperfect Board Member, which is sort of a more sort of like storytelling version of I think what Dean was saying, but probably also longer. So if you're short on time, definitely read the small handbook. If you got time for, I think it's about 150-page quick read, The Imperfect Board Member as well. Jessica, there's also the issue of control. If the organization serves marginalized people, having a voice at the organization may be one of the only places in life where a volunteer feels they have a voice. So when they feel like the organization they love and trust had devoted their lives to taking their voice away. Yeah, I think that's it. So Jessica, I agree with you. And I think there's a range of organizations, even within this sort of spectrum of organizations that will be thinking about these issues. So the example I gave of the charity that I sort of have a line of sight on, they've actually gone to say, like, members of the community we serve are the ones who get a vote. And I mean, that gets really tricky if they're not sort of using community-centric philanthropy, or they're not able to drive their donations that way, because the flip side is, and I sort of mentioned it before, on like the donor side is taking away voices of donors can have serious impacts as well. Clarity is important. Selective on the council. Dina, the communications piece is so important. Committee members need to understand their mandate as well as their specific role is within the organization and what the decision-making protocol looks like. So I agree with you. I think that there's a real push and pull between I'm a voting member and I have voting rights. And look, I'm a big fan of saying this because I run tight AGMs. There's like 4 things members get to vote on every year, right? You get to vote on the board, you get to vote on bylaw changes, you get to vote on the financials, and you get to vote on who the auditor is next year. And everything else is sort of within the purview of the people you chose as board members. And that can get very, very tricky as well. So it's not just about curtailing members' rights, but it's about helping them understand where they actually do have the right to have binding input as opposed to advisory input. Very, very good point. Strong terms of reference, absolutely key. Yes. Dean, can you please put this book suggestion in the chat? Value proposition is so key. Volunteers need to be equipped with all the messages they need to socialize the organization, especially if they are expected to fundraise. That's an incredible point, Adina. I think fundraising is often a volunteer task, and as with many other things, under-resourced. So I think I would also say, because we have been talking about scoping volunteer authority, that an important thing too is also scoping what a volunteer can commit to in soliciting donations, but that is a kettle of worms that I would suggest maybe is worth a deeper dive. There you go. Okay, and Dean's put the links to those two books in the chat as well. Those were a lot of ideas. Thank you so much. I'm walking away with ideas, which is always great. And let's see here. So I think we covered this a lot already, but I just sort of want to dive down a little bit. Heather did a great job of sort of preempting a lot of what I'm about to say, which is, where is the balance between the good governance decision and the belonging that volunteers feel, right? So that first point, understanding the rationale for restricting members' rights. So I would surmise, although I don't know, that some of the people dialing into this webinar may not have had the opportunities that Heather, Dean, and myself have had to really be sitting at the table, as one of my instructors said, belly to the boardroom table, making these decisions. And so if you are a frontline member manager who isn't in the boardroom when these decisions are being made, it's important for you to be asking for, and frankly, it's the obligation of the people who are in the room to help you understand how and why these decisions were made, so that they can be communicated to members in a way that sort of mitigates some of the potential damage we're talking about. It's also important to understand the historical sort of context. And in this case, I actually mean the context that members believe is true. So I used to work with a guy who said there's three versions of the story: your version, my version, and the truth. And it's important, I think, to understand how members view their existing influence over the organization, because that's really going to help scope how much information and how much sort of communications has to happen to help move them with you along this sort of evolutionary path. It's important to be looking at exhausting your options. So it is easy, loosely speaking, from a governance perspective, to say we're going to change a bunch of words in the bylaws and that's the end of the story. And it gets us somewhere, but it doesn't exhaust all of some of those recognition options, things that might go into policies and procedures. And from the volunteer manager perspective, it's also important to be able to quantify in some way the value of those volunteer contributions, because very often at the boardroom table, at the same time we're talking about governance and sustainability, we're talking about the finance and the budget and balancing the budget. And so it's important to be able to say, you know what, guys, like, I understand we are looking to increase our predictability around what's going to happen at the AGM, but we also budgeted, like, we're going to get, you know, I don't know, 800 volunteer hours this year. And if we put those hours at risk, the broader picture and the broader plan is at risk. And so I really want to sort of highlight that, and I hope in this talk I've been able to kind of help highlight and balance out some of those priorities. So the key takeaways here are changes to how NFPs are not-for-profit, by the way, are legislated, required bylaw reviews for compliance. Some not-for-profits made or are making adjustments to members' rights. The changes to members' rights could impact volunteer engagement and belonging, which is where the rubber hits the road with this group. And just a note that being able to kind of measure and understand that volunteer contribution could mitigate the impact on the core functionalities of your organization. So I know we've already had a pretty good chat, but I'm opening up the floor for a Q&A, and also noting there's already a note in the chat from Adina about having a skills matrix for the board helps a lot, and that's absolutely true. I think having a well-skilled and balanced board that understands the whole organization, including the contribution of your volunteers, is really important in mitigating these sort of crazy decisions from happening in the first place.
Mhm. Forgive me, Danielle, if you actually got to all of the early chat comments, but we had an early one from Adina about networking, and also one from Adam James on peer recognition. Really good points to add to very many that were shared.
So I do apologize. I agree. Yes, Dina, I'll go back one slide. In theory. So the 2 points, sorry, Dean, were networking and
Yes, Adina mentioned the value of networking in her experience. And I was going to say how great it is to have you in our network here in PAVRO for sure. But her specific comment was creating more networking opportunities at in-person touch points. Yeah. And then Adam James had an important point too, is on peer recognition as compared to organizational recognition of individual volunteers.
yeah, so I'll touch both of those points really quickly. One was the networking piece, and Dean, I agree with you. I mean, over a great many years, you and I have had the opportunity to meet and to network, and previously we served very similar organizations, which allowed us to sort of also have very similar board members and all of those sorts of pieces. And so that led us to be having a conversation a number of months ago, where you sort of said, hey, you know, PAVRO has these webinars. Is this something maybe you might be interested in? And I had this incredibly nerdy topic that I was excited to talk about with volunteer managers. So I agree with you. I will say it's possible that Adina was talking about the value that volunteers get from the network. And I would also say that's an incredibly important point when we talk about the mitigation of some of these issues. So if coming to the annual meeting for you is more about building your network than voting, then making sure that you still have a way to engage with the other members is incredibly important. And to Adam's point, I believe it was, on peer recognition, couldn't agree more. I think that one of the things that's important for boards to understand in member-based organizations as well is that they are the peers in the same way that often boards in for-profits are elected from among a group of shareholders or stakeholders. Boards in not-for-profits are elected from among the members and the people who have an interest in the mission. And it's important for boards to realize that they are peers to the other volunteers and that everybody is a volunteer, and to really have that sort of equity lens or equity footing lens when they think about these decisions and how they might impact the organization. I'll leave it open for any other question. Heather.
Yeah. I was just going to say, just thinking of Jessica's point around the idea of, for individuals who may have barriers, or this, from an equity perspective, if a decision is made to make changes to a membership category, this also opens up a door to invite those, within those groups who are going to be affected, to invite them to participate in the new structure. So it's not necessarily, I mean, it is a closing of a door. It perhaps is not the opening fully of another one, but perhaps it's the opening of a window, to at least start those conversations, because there may be opportunities that this presents that don't necessarily seem as obvious when you're having those conversations around we're going to change from a governance perspective. But and I like how you put it in your presentation, Danielle, around that idea of the balance between good governance and prioritizing belonging, because we need both of those for effective organizations to have incredible impact in our communities. So I think if the decision makers keep both of those points top of mind during discussions and deliberations, I believe that you can come to the best solution. And the other thing too is, I mean, Anka has a deadline, but bylaws can still be changed too. So I mean, not that you want to make this an experiment. However, for some organizations, that may be what it feels like, because you're perhaps feel like you must make these changes. But none of us have a crystal ball. I think the world would be a whole lot better if some of us did. But so there, and although it's a pain point, if you have to change things in the future, that date of October 18th is a date set kind of arbitrarily, really, because there are really no Anka police who are going to come bang on your door. But it's a good exercise to go through this, and I think it'll really, for some organizations, it's going to be a real awakening in perhaps bringing them their missions and statements and bylaws and things into the 21st century and beyond. So again, just as we're thinking about this too, I think a really key part that especially frontline volunteer engagement professionals can play is making sure that they are listening to our volunteers and reporting up, what those feelings are, what those sentiments are, how people are reacting to this, because you can't assume that the leadership knows if we don't tell them. And it would be maybe isn't the right word. It would be but it's the only one I can think of. A better conversation coming from a staff person, from someone who has that touch point with the volunteers, than to have the volunteers themselves come and, as you say, try to vote out the board or something. So again, it comes down to communications. It comes down to having good communications, good listening skills, and prioritizing that belonging plus good governance for the good of the organization, which I think also speaks to ensuring that we're doing our best for those who are looking to get things out of it for themselves, because everyone, even if they subconsciously is volunteering for something that's going to make them feel good, or feel that they've had an impact.
Yeah, altruism is pure altruism is really hard for anybody, because I think a lot of people have 2 reasons or 3 reasons for doing things. And I agree, I mean, Dean kind of touched on it as well. Like, some of the people who are in it for themselves end up adding to the organization, because that becomes part of how they kind of feel good about themselves. And so I agree with you. I know personally, I'm at a point in my career where I have the luxury of volunteering for things and not really caring whether or not they add to my resume. But there was a time when I was a young professional where I definitely wanted to do a good job. I definitely wanted to make an impact, but I was also sort of like, oh, what is this going to look like on my CV? That's an incredibly privileged place to be, that I know often takes people a very long time in their career to get there. So I 100% agree. Okay, and so with that, I will just say I hope you take the time to stay connected with me, to connect with me. I do have, as I sort of mentioned jokingly off the top, a very busy full-time job. So I'm not doing a lot of speaking, facilitating, and consulting at the moment. But more than happy to help connect you with somebody if there was something I said today where you're like, oh, I think I need help with that. And beyond that, I hope you'll connect on LinkedIn, and I hope you'll join my personal sort of community. I write a weekly newsletter called Tuesday Thoughts, and I hope you'll join me there. And that's all I got. Mr. Black.
Thank you so much, Danielle. In short, you are a gem and you added great value to our professionalism here in the PAVRO Forum. So glad that you could join us and do this for us. I just wanted to send a quick shout out to Adam James, who is with us today. Adam is coming back to us with the next 2 webinars over the next 3 months. We'll be sending out information very, very soon. And he's going to be speaking to a number of similar but important issues too, on the essence of volunteering, touching on some of the key ideas and processes that I know most of the folks who join us are interested in. I would like to hand it over to our president, Heather, for a final word and maybe greetings for the happiest of New Year's to all.
Thank you very much, Dean. Yes, thank you everyone for being here today. Daniela, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation and very, very valuable information. Yes, thank you to everyone for attending today. I do hope that this is going to kick off your 2024 with some great information. And as Dean has mentioned, we're going to continue this with Adam coming up in the next couple of months. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next PAVRO event.
Thank you.